Hello and welcome to the Byline podcast from the Byline Times. It's what the papers don't say, what radio doesn't report, and what telly doesn't tell you. This time, 5 questions for Nigel Farage, posed by Byline Times co-founder Peter Jukes. Farage, the architect of Brexit, now leader of the Reform Party, has enjoyed, you might think, a disproportionate platform already on the nation's airwaves. Although Reform have precisely 0 MPs, to my eyes and ears anyway, he's certainly been on TV and radio more than the Greens, who did at least have 1 seat in the outgoing Parliament, and even Ed Davey, the leader of the Lib Dems, who had 15 seats. Farage likes being asked questions on migration, he wants to reduce it, and the NHS, he wants to reform it. But Peter joins me now to talk about the issues that Nigel has so far kept stum about, maybe because he hasn't been asked. And Peter, these questions are all about the pro-Brexit campaign, Leave EU, and potential links to Russia. So just talk us through it. I know people can read the full article at bylinetimes.com, but just tell us what the key points are.
Yeah, so just a background to that, because he's no longer just an MEP or a failed parliamentary candidate. I think it's 7 or 8 times he's failed to get in Parliament. He, by coming back at the last moment, Rishi Sunak called a snap election initially. Nigel Farage said, oh, no, I'm off to the States to work on the Trump campaign. Very patriotic. But obviously, he changed his mind. He's now running in Clacton, where he stands a good chance of winning. So he is a different level of politician. This is somebody who isn't just floating around Strasbourg causing difficulties or appearing 38 times, is it, on Question Time, talking about Brexit. He is now seeking public funding as our elected representative, at least Clacton's, in Parliament. And I think the kind of scrutiny he's had in the past, his great copy, isn't he? He's always sort of matey. He's got a cigar, a cigarette, and a pint of beer in his hand. He's man of the people. And he was a city trader and went to a private school. But anyway, you can see why media organizations have loved him for the last 10 or 15 years as kind of the voice of the people. But now he's seeking to become a member of Parliament. So I thought I'd go back through some of the stuff that I and others have been working on about Leave EU and Nigel Farage and his multiple connections to Russia. Now, the questions I'm going to ask, some of them at the time, there may be excuses that he didn't know, but a lot of them become very different in the light of the full invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Then it became clear that Putin's Russia wasn't just sort of a post-communist society we could do business with. It had aggressive imperial ambitions in Europe. It fully invaded Ukraine with a large army, causing 14 million people to flee, at least 500,000 casualties, if you all told up, and the biggest war in Europe for 8 years. So suddenly, by 2022, Vladimir Putin becomes a different proposition. But what's clear, my first question to Nigel Farage is that back in 2018, if you recall, the FBI special counsel Robert Mueller started investigating Donald Trump's close connections to various figures close to Russia. And at that time, suddenly people woke up to Nigel Farage's proximity to Donald Trump and his connections to Russia today. And, quite openly, public statements saying, well, Putin's the world leader I most admire. He's later said, I don't like him, but I admire him because he's effective. And they asked him, have you ever met the Russian ambassador? And he said he's never met him. That's Alexander Yakovenko, the ambassador's court of St. James, as was in 2018. But immediately, people looked on the website of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Russian ministry there, their London embassy website, and found a photograph of Ambassador Yakovenko meeting with Nigel Farage in May 2013. So did he forget? Why did he? I mean, that's a very interesting question. But we go back to 2013, and this is the result of lots of investigations by me and others. That is when we now know Ambassador Yakovenko started a campaign to infiltrate both the Conservative Party and UKIP. It's a different story. Sergei Nolobin, Conservative Friends of Russia, leave that there. But the other spy, when that all blew up in 2012 and it was cancelled, people realized what was going on, UKIP was the next target. And another, well, he says he's just a diplomat, but he was expelled in 2018 after the Skripal attacks. Alexander Udod visited the Doncaster conference where UKIP was on a racecourse and befriended none other than a close confidant Nigel Farage at that point, about to become the head of communications for Leave EU, a guy called Andy Wigmore. So that is, in that context, 2013, there is obviously interest from the Russian embassy in UKIP and in Farage. Let us point out, Farage was a regular paid broadcaster on Russia Today. Now, to be fair to Farage, around that time, I appeared on RT Russia Today, not knowing quite how embedded it was in the Russian state apparatus. It's basically controlled by Putin. I talked about the Daniel Morgan murder and stuff like that. But Farage appeared so often, they offered him his own show. RT would regularly broadcast his rare interventions in the European Parliament. So this is really important. What are the connections directly between Nigel Farage and the Russian ambassador Alexander Yakovenko? Why it matters now is that Yakovenko clearly was pushing for Brexit. It was part, as Nafeez Ahmed has documented on Byline Times, a strategic plan to sever the UK from the EU. The EU was seen as their great enemy. You've got to remember the Maidan Glorious Revolution in Ukraine, in Kiev, which ousted the pro-Russian president Yanukovych, was about joining the EU. Ukraine wanted to join the EU. So the EU is one of Putin's great enemies at this point. This is clearly Russian strategy to peel the UK away from the EU, and Nigel Farage was a major leader of the Brexit idea. And Yakovenko, when he returned to Moscow after Boris Johnson was installed, interestingly enough, and Brexit was going to get done, get Brexit done, he left. And just to show you how important Yakovenko is to Putin's strategic plan, and that's why, you can see him sending these spies to target both conservatives and UKIP. When he arrived back in Moscow, he was given the Alexander Nevsky Medal, which is a very high honor, which Alexander Nevsky was a famous Russian hero who fought the West, by the way, the Swedes, and he was made head of the diplomatic school in Moscow. So Yakovenko really knows what's going on. And according to Luke Harding, who spoke to a diplomat present at that awarding of the medal, Yakovenko says, "We have crushed the British to the ground. They are on their knees and they will not rise for a very long time." So my first question is, why did you lie about meeting Alexander Yakovenko, Nigel?
Well, let's just be clear as well, Peter. We're not suggesting that Nigel Farage was in any way deliberately acting on behalf of the Russian state, but the agenda that he was pursuing chimed with Russia's agenda, a pro-Brexit agenda. And although I'm not in the habit of meeting ambassadors, and Nigel Farage moves in different circles to me, I suspect that if I, or indeed most people, had met a Russian ambassador, they would remember that. So at the very least, it is a puzzle that he can't account for the fact that he met the Russian ambassador, denies having met him, even though clearly, plainly, he did.
Yes, no, this is very important because, as I said, I have been on Russia Today in 2016 talking about the Daniel Morgan murder and Murdoch. I was also around that time invited to the Russian embassy, would you believe, Adrian? I think around the phone hacking. And I thought, I remember my thought processes. Yes, maybe I'll accept. I won't take my phone and I won't talk to any attractive young women at that event. Yeah, I just forgot. I and I didn't go. And lots of people went to the embassy. Yes, absolutely. There was no reason in 2013 Nigel Farage just suspected quite what the Russian agenda was. At that point, it really only manifested itself clearly, I'd say, with the invasion of Ukraine. But it was obvious by 2018. That's when we had the Skripal attack. Novichok used to target a Russian dissident. This killed a British citizen, Dawn Sturgis, and could have killed a lot of people in the town of Salisbury. The gloves were off. He was asked in 2018, maybe it's embarrassment. Yeah, that question could be answered, and there's an innocent explanation. Can I go to question 2?
Yeah.
Because I think it gets more complicated. Now, I understand why some journalists don't want to ask this question, because it relates to Aaron Banks, the funder of Levy. He was a backer of UKIP before it became the campaign, late 2015, after David Cameron announced his referendum. But he was a supporter of UKIP, Aaron Banks, a Bristol-based businessman. And he became, at that point, one of the largest donors in British history, giving £8 million to Leave EU. That's Farage's campaign. He and his sort of sidekick, his head of communications, Andy Wigmore. As I said, Wigmore was approached in 2015 in Doncaster, late September, and said, "Why do you want to see the embassy?" Within weeks, a meeting is set up, and Aaron Banks goes to see the Russian ambassador. Now, this becomes, it's not tricky, but people get aware of it because of this famous, well, it's some famous court case between Carol Cadwalladr and Aaron Banks, which he kind of won the first round. He won some stuff on appeal. Now, none of what I'm saying is disputed at all. The kind of libel issue, which was inadvertent by Carol, I know her, she never meant to say he took any money. And I'll repeat, there's no evidence Aaron Banks took any money. But he said he had one boozy lunch with the Russian ambassador in November 2015. It turned out to be many more, as these emails revealed. And the court judgment documents, of the four we know about, the judge, Justice Stein, surmises there were probably many more. So we know that at that point, and throughout late 2015, throughout the Brexit campaign, afterwards to the point where Farage goes over to help the Trump campaign, there were multiple meetings between Leave EU and the Russian embassy, in which, and we don't know what happened, there's no suggestion any of that money went to banks or was funneled back into Leave EU, they did talk about gold and diamond privatization deals, high state companies, which there was offered perhaps lucrative fire sale deals to the team of Leave EU. Now, it is fairly inconceivable to me that at that time, 2015, 2016, through both UKIP conference, through the Leave EU campaign, which Farage fronted, there was not a conversation between Wigmore and Banks and Farage saying we're going off to the Russian embassy. I just find that difficult to believe. How could he not have known about Aaron Banks's multiple visits to the Russian embassy during the Brexit campaign? I think nobody's asked him that, as I said, because this became legally enmeshed. Let me say that Aaron Banks and Andy Wigmore are quite forward in their accusations. They were actually pulled up by the DCMS Select Committee in Parliament in 2018 to answer questions about this, and they walked out. So they are quite, let's say, forthright. And I do think that sort of scares journalists off. But there are many unanswered questions and definitely a riot of meetings. And let's just to conclude this section on, we're talking 2016, 17, that not only was Aaron Banks a major funder of Leave EU itself, the campaign, £8 million reportedly to that, he was also personally, apparently, according to Channel 4, backing Nigel Farage. He provided a 4.4 million rented home, a luxury car, bodyguard, a private office, and trips to the United States. So they were close, financially close. What happens then is Nigel Farage, having, he hasn't won it personally, but the combination of campaigns, Vote Leave, fronted by Boris Johnson and Michael Gove, and his own campaign, leads to that momentous Brexit vote, as we all remember. The next thing that happens that year is, of course, the Trump vote. So what Nigel Farage does is go off to America. He goes to the Republican National Conference, where Trump is nominated and appears on the campaign trail with Trump. He is mated with Trump. Now, at that time, my third question is, what did Farage know about the Russian hacking of the Clinton campaign?
It's possible he knew nothing, Peter.
But let me tell you why he was bang in the middle of these events. It wasn't like he was sort of outside the circle. He went to the Republican National Conference and met with a guy called Roger Stone. Roger Stone, quite a colorful character. He has been indicted, and I think pardoned, but not unindicted. He's been pardoned by Trump for contempt of Congress and various other things. He never went to jail, but he had to admit guilt for them. So Roger Stone, in that phase of 2016, there was a famous hacking of the Democratic National Committee, the head chairman, John Podesta. And we now know the Russian military intelligence, GRU, hacked their emails and released them strategically at certain times during the campaign. And Roger Stone is on the record, there are investigations into him, was begging for a Russian account called Guccifer on Twitter to give them information, and was actively trying to get hold of Julian Assange, because Julian Assange said he also had them emails and he would publish. He did, by the way, in October 2016, a crucial moment, which is when these Access Hollywood tapes came out, and they all showed Trump using very misogynistic language, denigrating women, and that suddenly all this stuff came out, these hacks from the Democratic Hillary Clinton campaign. Now, back in July, Nigel Farage was meeting with Roger Stone and Alex Jones, who runs this infamous InfoWars site, which has been sued by, the parents of the Sandy Hook families who were shot in a terrible incident in America, mass shooting, and Alex Jones said they were making it up. They were actors. So he was bang in the middle of those people who were looking to parlay Russian hacked emails into the campaign. And people were eventually arrested. 16 Russians were indicted through this firm, the Internet Research Agency, which was, pushing out misinformation, and named GRU, which is the Russian military intelligence operatives, were also named in indictment. So that was a serious intervention, illegal hacking in the American campaign, which didn't seem to bother Donald Trump, apparently, according to his lawyer, who was there when Roger Stone was ringing him, saying, I'm going to get Julian Assange I'm going to get him to the reason at exactly the right time. Now, we don't know about those meetings in America and the RNC when Farage was there with Stone. He didn't want them filmed. We know that much because he said cameras go away. But two things then happen. In the indictments, there is multiple references in Roger Stone's communications to a friend in London who will talk to Assange. Some of them were tracked down. It's in the weeds. People like Jerome Corsi, Ted Malloch. It's a bit boring. But there's one friend in London we never tracked down. Now, he's never been asked, Nigel Farage, was he the friend in London? Did he have anything to do with talking to Assange in London, locked away in the Ecuadorian embassy, as we remember, and the timing of those emails? He'd be denied being a go-between, but he's never been asked if he was involved in that. And this becomes salient because a year later, not long later, about 6 months later, Farage was snapped by BuzzFeed coming out of the Ecuadorian embassy with his assistant or his producer, I think, where Julian Assange was holed up seeking asylum in Ecuadorian territory for reasons right or wrong. I don't blame him for that. I do have criticisms about some of his actions at this point. And when asked, as is coming out, what did you talk Assange about? He said, I don't remember. So I think there is a question there was never asked. I think a German newspaper, Die Zeit, did ask him some more questions and he refused to. But he has a crucial role, or potentially as a crucial witness into something which is wrong. A foreign, actually hostile state hacking emails, releasing them to interfere with the most important election you can imagine, a presidential campaign. And my question would be to Raj, did you know anything about it? Were you worried? Did you inform the authorities? Now, question 4, right? This relates to the wider relationship with Steve Bannon. So question 4 is, how could Farage be blind to Donald Trump, and Steve Bannon's backing for Russia? Because what I'm saying here is that we know much more about Steve Bannon now. He is facing jail time for contempt of Congress. I think in early July, around about the election, he's due to spend 4 months in jail. He was also prosecuted, indicted, and convicted of fraudulent activity around Build the Wall, his campaign fundraising to build a wall to Mexico, between Mexico and America, which was deemed to be fraudulent. But he was pardoned again by Donald Trump as he left office in 2021. Farage has been friends with Steve Bannon since at least 2011. Bannon thought that Farage could basically start up a Tea Party movement. That's what Steve Bannon was into, this sort of national populism to the right of the Republican Party, insurrectionary, especially after the crash. And anyway, they got on so well that, and it hasn't been denied by Farage, Farage actually sent Bannon a picture of him as Napoleon. So he thought that Bannon had a strategic role to make. And really interesting, the video's now deleted, but drinking a pint after the Brexit referendum vote, which went a lot of people shocked, surprised, but apparently legitimate vote to leave. He's raised the pint and he says, "Thank you, Bannon. Well done, Bannon. Well done, Breitbart. You helped with this hugely."
And Breitbart, just for people who don't know, was Bannon's...
Let me just explain. Breitbart was an organization taken over by Bannon, I think funded by the hedge fund billionaire Robert Mercer at that point, At the same time, he's co-founded Cambridge Analytica, which is the infamous, now shuttered data electioneering, which hacked up to 70 million Facebook profiles to target people, profile them, and target them over election campaigns. We know it worked extensively in the Trump campaign. It's always denied being involved in Brexit, but especially through Bannon, there's a lot of evidence it was involved in Brexit. I have an invoice to none other than Aaron Banks for £40,000 payable to Steve Bannon for processing UKIP membership data for Leave EU, right? Well, UKIP Leave EU, but they were merging at that point. So when he says thank you, Bannon, for Breitbart, Breitbart was a publishing arm that called an alt-right publishing arm, but basically heavily politicized news, sometimes disinformation, to be honest, targeted at voters working in alliance with Cambridge Analytica. They shared their tags, right? Their targeting tags. So he used to call this combination of electioneering data campaign at Cambridge Analytica and Breitbart his weapons. So they helped with Brexit. Well, it's sufficient enough for Nigel Farage to thank them, yeah? That was never declared. One of the reasons the actual CEO of Cambridge Analytica, Alexander Nix, was boasted about working on Brexit, and they said, oh, no, we never did. That work was never declared. It was as electoral spending.
But the question you're getting to relates to Russia. Again, we go back to Russia again.
Yes, absolutely. We'll get to Russia, but the key thing is at this point, Bannon's mates with Farage. Bannon's a co-founder of Cambridge Analytica. There's undeclared work for Leave EU and Farage being, how could he not know that? But yes, Bannon was working in alliance. We now know data was handed over via Cambridge Analytica consultant to the GRU in the military intelligence in the Kremlin or in Russia. At the same time, it seems that in the same targeting system, the Internet Troll Factory, this famous internet research agency run by the now deceased Russian oligarch Yevgeny Prigozhin, was targeting American and UK voters in that election with disinformation, highly targeted stuff, particularly in swing seats. The data which was handed over to a third party as alleged to be a GRU agent was targeting data. And as with Brexit, as with the American election, we all know it's on tiny margins in swing states. In America, it's just like 17,000 people could sway that election. So not only does he, what does he know about Bannon's involvement with Leave EU? What does he know about Bannon handing over data, working in league with the Russians? And, if you look at Bannon's statements ever since, he's very, very pro-Putin. In fact, overtly so. So that becomes very, very interesting. So this brings us all to a question now, right?
This brings us to question 5 then. Why did Farage hide the assessment that his Leave EU campaign funder was, quotes, an agent of Russian influence?
So Adrian, just concluding all this, there are ways you could conceive through being really busy and, just being a bit naive or just not answering the question that Nigel Farage could have missed, how, UKIP and he were targeted by Russia today and the Russian embassy back then. He could, not have known that his head funder for Leave EU and head of communications was having all the meetings at the Russian embassy. He may not be even aware of his mate and buddy Steve Bannon's use of his weapons, Breitbart and Cambridge Analytica, in alliance apparently with the Russian troll farms, for pushing for Trump and Brexit. It is all conceivable, especially if you're in a pub smoking a cigar, a man of the people. You just, you don't look at this like we have to do down in the weeds or this nitty gritty. It's all fine. They're all good people. But by 2017, that is untenable. Why? Because by 2017, the FBI had turned their eyes to London in their investigation of Russian interference. One of their first indictments was of a Trump aide, George Papadopoulos, who had met in London with a Maltese professor called Joseph Mitsud, who told him that he could help him get Hillary's emails and dirt on Hillary Clinton, which would derail the campaign, with the help of the Russian ambassador, the one who met Farage, who's all over this, Alexander Yakovenko. Now, that causes a massive alert in government. In fact, so much so that then Secretary of State for Defense, Gavin Williamson, apparently through court records, contacts none other than the co-founder of Leave EU, now the co-founder of Nigel Farage's Reform Party, a guy called Richard Tice. Richard Tice then alerts, I mean, they're in a relationship now, we don't know if they were then, but Isabel Oakeshott, she wrote the book with Aaron Banks called The Bad Boys of Brexit, published in 2016-17. Before all this kind of Russian stuff was definitely before it's apparent to the FBI. And because of this warning, and Williamson allegedly said, he's deep in this, Aaron Banks, she went back and looked at some of those emails, which she hadn't looked at before. She says in her attic, yeah, how has she got those emails? Who knows? But she had some emails and then noticed all these meetings. These are the same emails that Carol Cadwalladr and I eventually got. In November 2017, she's so concerned about it. She contacts the Sunday Times. They agree to run a story on it. They provide an indemnity. And in her statement in 2017, she says she is concerned that Banks could be working as an agent of influence for the Russian state, and she could not stand by while Banks publicly lies about his connection to hostile foreign powers. So 2017, she's concerned enough to hand over the materials to the Sunday Times, write an op-ed on it, and sign an indemnity that they will protect her from privacy or defamation clauses. What happens next? Nothing. Now, at that point, she is close to Tice and Farage, and it seems inconceivable to me, absolutely inconceivable, she didn't warn Nigel Farage about what was going on. In fact, we know she warned him when it came out later, or rather contacted him, according to source, very upset the emails had come out, because nothing happened for 8 months. And Carol Cadwalladr and I were sufficiently concerned. We knew about this tranche of emails. We hoped it would come out through then. We decided to publish it ourselves in a hurry. They do a different version on the Sunday Times. But that's 8 months, 2017 to mid-2018. That's when all the questions about Brexit are raising attempted Russian influence, multiple meetings, offers of gold diamond deals to Leave EU campaign. There's no doubt, whatever happened on the Leave EU side, that was Russian attempted interference, putting aside all the digital stuff we already know. Did they inform the authorities? Doesn't sound like it. In fact, an investigation was only launched by the NCA and it went nowhere, when we revealed the emails in June 2018. So there's that 8 months they sit on it. I find it inconceivable Nigel Farage did not know then what had gone on. And what I'm told, this is not from Farage, from other people around the campaign and around the book, is they didn't want to derail Brexit. If this came out, it might derail Brexit. Remember, this is all, I talk of the second vote is all going on. I find that deeply worrying, because just put Brexit aside. Just think about electoral integrity. Think about this country. If you're conservative, if you're a reform supporter, if you're Labour, Green, Lib Dem, it doesn't matter. The idea that covertly a foreign power, now known to be a hostile power, though it murdered 2 British citizens and we should have known it back then, is intervening in your election, trying to distort the result, following an agenda of its own. And people didn't blow the whistle. That, to me, is a scandal which needs to be investigated. I believe under Keir Starmer, it will be investigated. In their first 100 days, one of their focuses on our security. The fact that British politicians, British journalists turned a blind eye for whatever reason, fear, compromise, I don't know, collusion. I'm not saying they're colluding, but they failed to blow the whistle. And I say to Nigel Farage, why didn't you speak up when our democracy was under attack?
Peter, thank you very much indeed. Just to say, anybody who's mentioned in this podcast, if you feel that you've been unfairly treated, by all means do get in touch. Drop us an email to goldbergradio@gmail.com and we'll be delighted to give you a right of reply. And very specifically to Nigel Farage, if you want to respond to any or all of those questions, if you want to come on and debate them on the Byline podcast, perhaps with me, perhaps with Peter, we'd be delighted to host you. The offer is there and the door is open. do head over to bylinetimes.com where you can read the article in full. That's also where you can take out a subscription to the Byline Times, our fantastic monthly news periodical. In so doing, you not only get the best of our online offerings, you get content that you can't read anywhere else, and you'll be helping to support this podcast. And just to say as well, Peter, people can now listen to your delightful dulcet tones at bylineaudio.com as well. We've got some fantastic audio offerings these days too.
And we have you, Adrian, now on that. And we have a great show called Utter Bollocks. It sounds rude, but it's not. It's fun. It's about disinformation. And soon, Bonnie Greer and Hadit Mitharo in Americana.
Thanks very much indeed for listening. This has been a We Bring Audio production for Byline Audio, produced in Birmingham by me, Adrian Goldberg. We'll see you again very soon. But for now, thanks for listening. Cheers.
Byline Audio.